Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to urge the Congress to think twice before thrusting this nation into a war without merit, one fraught with danger of escalating into something no American will be pleased with. Thomas Jefferson advised, quote, "Never was so much false arithmetic employed on any subject as that which has been employed to persuade nations that it is in their interest to go to war," close quote. We have for months now heard plenty of false arithmetic and lame excuses on why we must pursue a preemptive war of aggression against an impoverished third world nation 6,000 miles from our shores that doesn't even possess a Navy or Air Force, with a pretense that it must be done for national security interests. For some reason, such an attack makes me feel much less secure while our country is made more vulnerable. Congress must consider the fact that those with military experience advise a go-slow policy, and those without military experience are the ones demanding this war. We cannot ignore the fact that all Iraq's Arab neighbors are opposed to this attack, and our European allies object as well. And if the military and diplomatic reasons for a policy of restraint makes no sense, I advise consider the $100 billion it will cost.
I was recently asked why I thought it was a bad idea for the president to initiate a war against Iraq. I responded by saying that I could easily give a half a dozen reasons why, and if I took a minute, I could give a full dozen. For starters, here's a half a dozen. Number one, Congress has not given the president the legal authority to wage war against Iraq as directed by the Constitution, nor does he have UN authority to do so. Even if he did, it would not satisfy the rule of law laid down by the framers of the Constitution. Number two, Iraq has not initiated aggression against the United States. Invading Iraq and deposing Saddam Hussein, no matter how evil a dictator he may be, has nothing to do with our national security. Iraq does not have a single airplane in its air force and is a poverty-ridden third world nation, hardly a threat to the U.S. security. Stirring up a major conflict in this region would actually jeopardize our security. Number three, a war against Iraq initiated by the United States cannot be morally justified. Arguing that someday in the future Saddam Hussein might pose a threat to us means that any nation, any place in the world is subject to an American invasion without cause. This would be comparable to the impossibility of proving a negative. Number four, initiating a war against Iraq will surely antagonize all neighboring Arab and Muslim nations, as well as the Russians, the Chinese, and the European Union, if not the whole world. Even the English people are reluctant to support Tony Blair's prodding of our president to invade Iraq. There's no practical benefit for such action. Iraq could end up in even more dangerous hands like Iran. Number five, an attack on Iraq will not likely be confined to Iraq alone. Spreading the war to Israel and rallying all Arab nations against her may well end up jeopardizing the very existence of Israel. The president has already likened the current international crisis more to that of World War II than the more localized Vietnam War. The law of unintended consequences applies to international affairs every bit as much as to domestic interventions. Yet the consequences of such are much more dangerous. Number six, the cost of a war against Iraq would be prohibitive. We paid a heavy economic price for the Vietnam War in direct cost, debt, and inflation, and this coming war could be a lot more expensive. Our national debt is growing at a rate greater than $250 billion per year, and this will certainly accelerate. The dollar cost would be the least of our concerns compared to the potential loss of innocent lives, both theirs and ours. The systematic attack on civil liberties that accompanies all wars cannot be ignored. Already we hear cries for resurrecting the authoritarian program of conscription in the name of patriotism, of course. Could any benefit come from all this warmongering? Possibly. Let's hope and pray so. It should be evident that big government is anathema to individual liberty. In a free society, the role of government is to protect the individual's right to life and liberty. The biggest government of all, the UN, consistently threatens personal liberties and U.S. sovereignty. But our recent move toward unilateralism hopefully will inadvertently weaken the United Nations. Our participation, more often than not lately, is conditioned on following the international rules and courts and trade agreements only when they please us, flaunting the consensus without rejecting internationalism on principle, as we should. The way these international events will eventually play out is unknown, and in the process we expose ourselves to great danger. Instead of replacing today's international government, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and the International Criminal Court, with free and independent republics, it's more likely that we will see a rise of militant nationalism with a penchant for solving problems with arms and protectionism rather than free trade and peaceful negotiations. The last thing this world needs is the development of more nuclear weapons, as is now being planned in a pretense for ensuring the peace. We would need more than an Office of Strategic Information to convince the world of that. What do we need? We need a clear understanding and belief in a free society, a true republic that protects individual liberty, private property, free markets, voluntary exchange, and private solutions to social problems, placing strict restraints on government meddling in the internal affairs of others. Indeed, we live in challenging and dangerous times.
I have for years advocated a moral and constitutional approach to our foreign policy. This has been done in the sincerest belief that a policy of peace, trade, and friendship with all nations is far superior in all respects to a policy of war, protectionism, and confrontation. But in the Congress, I find, with regards to foreign affairs, no interest in following the precepts of the Constitution and the advice of our early presidents. Interventionism, internationalism, inflationism, protectionism, jingoism, and bellicosity are much more popular in our nation's capital than a policy of restraint. I have heard all the arguments on why we must immediately invade and occupy Iraq, and have observed that there are only a few hardy souls left in the Congress who are trying to stop this needless, senseless, and dangerous war. They have adequately refuted every one of the excuses for this war of aggression, but obviously either no one listens or the unspoken motives for this invasion silence those tempted to dissent. But the tragic and most irresponsible excuse for the war rhetoric is now emerging in the political discourse. We now hear rumblings that the vote is all about politics, the November elections, and the control of the U.S. Congress. That is, the main concern is political power. Can one imagine delaying the declaration of war against Japan after Pearl Harbor for political reasons? Or can one imagine forcing a vote on the issue of war before an election for political gain? Can anyone believe there are those who would foment war rhetoric for political gain at the expense of those who will be called to fight and might even die if the war doesn't go as planned? I don't want to believe it's possible, but rumors are rampant that looking weak on the war issue is considered to be unpatriotic and a risky political position to take before the November elections. Taking pleasure in the fact that this might place many politicians in a difficult position is a sobering thought indeed. There's a bit of irony over all this political posturing on a vote to condone a war of aggression and force some members into a tough vote. Guess what? Contrary to conventional wisdom, war is never politically beneficial to the politicians who promote it. Presidents Wilson and Roosevelt were reelected by promising to stay out of war. Remember, the party in power during the Korean War was routed in 1952 by a general who promised to stop the bloodshed. Vietnam, which started with overwhelming support and hype and jingoistic fervor, ended President Johnson's political career in disgrace and humiliation. The most significant blight on the short term of President Kennedy was his efforts at regime change in Cuba and the fate he met at the Bay of Pigs. Even Persian Gulf War I, thought at the time to be a tremendous victory with its aftermath still lingering, did not serve President Bush Sr.'s re-election efforts in 1992. War is not politically beneficial for two reasons. Innocent people die and the economy is always damaged. These two things, after the dust settles from the hype and the propaganda, always make the people unhappy. The euphoria associated with the dreams of grandiose and painless victories is replaced by the stark reality of death, destruction, and economic pain. Instead of euphoria, we end up with heartache, as we did after the Bay of Pigs, Korea, Vietnam, Somalia, and Lebanon. Since no one wants to hear any more of morality and constitutionality and justice, possibly some will listen to the politics of war, since that is what drives so many. A token victory at the polls this fall by using a vote on the war as a lever will be to little avail. It may not even work on the short run. Surely history shows that war is never a winner, especially when the people who have to pay, fight, and die for it come to realize that the war wasn't even necessary and had nothing to do with national security or fighting for freedom, but was promoted by special interests who stood to gain from taking over a sovereign country. Peace is always superior to war. It is a political winner. Soon we hope to have hearings on the pending war with Iraq. I'm concerned that there are some questions that won't be asked and maybe not even allowed to be asked. Here are some questions I would like answered by those who are anxious to start this war. Is it not true that the reason we did not bomb the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War was because we knew they could retaliate? Is it not also true that we are willing to bomb Iraq now because we know it cannot retaliate, which just confirms that there is no real threat? Is it not true that those who argue that even with inspections, we cannot be sure that Hussein might be hiding weapons, at the same time imply that we can be more sure that weapons exist in the absence of inspections? Is it not true that the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency was able to complete its yearly verification mission to Iraq just this year with Iraqi cooperation? Is it not true that the intelligence community has been unable to develop a case tying Iraq to global terrorism at all, much less the attacks on the United States last year? Does anybody remember that 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia and that none came from Iraq? Was former CIA counterterrorism chief Vincent Canestraro wrong when he recently said there is no confirmed evidence of Iraq's links to terrorism? Is it not true that the CIA has concluded there is no evidence that a Prague meeting between 9/11 hijacker Atta and Iraqi intelligence took place? Is it not true that northern Iraq, where the administration claimed Al-Qaeda were hiding out, is in the control of our allies, the Kurds? Is it not true that the vast majority of the Al-Qaeda leaders who escaped appear to have safely made their way to Pakistan, another of our so-called allies? Has anyone noticed that Afghanistan is rapidly sinking into chaos, with bombings and assassinations becoming daily occurrences, and that according to a recent UN report, the Al-Qaeda, quote, is by all accounts alive and well and poised to strike again how, when, and where it chooses, close quote? Why are we taking precious military intelligence resources away from tracking down those who did attack the United States and who may again attack the United States, and using them to invade countries that have not attacked the United States? Would an attack on Iraq not just confirm the Arabs' worst suspicions about the United States? And isn't this just what Osama bin Laden wanted to have happen? How can Hussein be compared to Hitler when he has no navy, no air force, and now has an army 1/5 the size it was 12 years ago, which even then proved itself totally inept in defending itself? Is it not true that the constitutional power to declare war is exclusively given to Congress? Should presidents, contrary to the Constitution, allow Congress to concur only when pressured by public opinion? Are presidents permitted to rely on UN permission to go to war? Are you aware of a Pentagon report studying charges that thousands of Kurds in one village were gassed by the Iraqis, which found no conclusive evidence that Iraq was responsible, that Iran occupied the very city involved, and that evidence indicates, according to this Pentagon report, the type of gas used was more likely controlled by Iran, not Iraq? Is it not true that between 100 to 300,000 U.S. soldiers have suffered from Persian Gulf War syndrome from the first Gulf War, and that thousands may have died? Are we prepared for possibly thousands of American casualties in a war against a country that does not have the capacity to attack the United States? Are we willing to bear the economic burden of a $100 billion war against Iraq, with oil prices expected to skyrocket and further rattle an already shaky American economy? How about an estimated 30 years occupation of Iraq that some have deemed necessary to build democracy there? Iraq's alleged violation of UN resolutions are given as a reason to initiate an attack. Yet, is it not true that hundreds of UN resolutions have been ignored by various countries without penalty? Did former President Bush not cite the UN resolution of 1990 as the reason he could not march into Baghdad, while supporters of a new attack assert that it is the very reason we can march into Baghdad? Is it not true that, contrary to current claims, the no-fly zones were set up by Britain and the United States without specific approval from the United Nations? Our government intervention in the economy, the private affairs of citizens, and the internal affairs of foreign countries leads to uncertainty and many unintended consequences. Here are some of the consequences about which we should be concerned. I predict U.S. taxpayers will pay to rebuild Palestine, both the West Bank and the Gaza, as well as Afghanistan. U.S. taxpayers paid to bomb these areas, so we will be expected to rebuild them. Peace of sorts will come to the Middle East, but will be short-lived. There will be big promises of more U.S. money and weapons flowing to Israel and to Arab countries allied with the United States. U.S. troops and others will be used to monitor the peace. In time, an oil boycott will be imposed, with oil prices soaring to historic highs. Current Israeli-United States policies will solidify Arab Muslim nations in their effort to avenge the humiliation of the Palestinians. This will include those Muslim nations that in the past have fought against each other. Some of our moderate Arab allies will be overthrown by Islamic fundamentalists. The UN will continue to condemn through resolutions Israeli-U.S. policies in the Middle East, and they will be ignored. Some European countries will clandestinely support the Muslim countries and their anti-Israel pursuits. China, ironically assisted by American aid, much more openly will sell the militant Muslims the weapons they want and will align herself with the Arab nations. The United States, with Tony Blair as head cheerleader, will attack Iraq without proper authority, and a major war, the largest since World War II, will result. Major moves will be made by China, India, Russia, and Pakistan in Central Asia to take advantage of the chaos for the purpose of grabbing land, resources, and strategic advantages sought after for years. The Karzai government will fail, and U.S. military presence will end in Afghanistan. An international dollar crisis will dramatically boost interest rates in the United States. Price inflation with a major economic downturn will decimate U.S. federal government finances and exploding deficits and uncontrolled spending. Federal Reserve policy will continue at an expanding rate with massive credit expansion, which will make the dollar crisis worse. Gold will be seen as an alternative to paper money as it returns to its historic role as money. Erosion of civil liberties here at home will continue as our government responds to political fear in dealing with the terrorist threat by making generous use of the powers obtained with the Patriot Act. The draft will be reinstated, causing domestic turmoil and resentment. Many American military personnel and civilians will be killed in the coming conflict. The leaders of whichever side loses the war will be hauled into and tried before the International Criminal Court for war crimes. The United States will not officially lose the war, but neither will we win. Our military and political leaders will not be tried by the International Criminal Court. The Congress and the President will shift radically toward expanding the size and scope of the federal government. This will satisfy both the liberals and the conservatives. Military and police powers will grow, satisfying the conservatives. The welfare state, both domestic and international, will expand, satisfying the liberals. Both sides will endorse military adventurism overseas. This is the most important of my predictions. Policy changes could prevent all of the previous predictions from occurring. Unfortunately, that will not occur. In due course, the Constitution will continue to be steadily undermined and the American Republic further weakened. During the next decade, the American people will become poorer and less free, while they become more dependent on the government for economic security. The war will prove to be divisive, with emotions and hatred growing between the various factions and special interests that drive our policies in the Middle East. Agitation from more class warfare will succeed in dividing us domestically. And believe it or not, I expect lobbyists will thrive more than ever during the dangerous period of chaos. I have no timetable for these predictions, but just in case, keep them around and look at them in 5 to 10 years. Let's hope and pray that I'm wrong on all accounts. If so, I will be very pleased.
Our inability to adapt to the tactics of fourth-generation warfare compounds our military failure. Unless we understand this, even doubling our troop strength will not solve the problems created by our occupation. The talk of a troop surge and jobs program in Iraq only distracts Americans from the very real possibility of an attack on Iran. Our growing naval presence in the region and our harsh rhetoric toward Iran are unsettling. Securing the Horn of Africa and sending Ethiopian troops into Somalia do not bode well for world peace. Yet these developments are almost totally ignored by Congress. Rumors are flying about when, not if, Iran will be bombed by either Israel or the United States, possibly with nuclear weapons. Our CIA says Iran is 10 years away from producing a nuclear bomb and has no delivery system. But this does not impede our plans to keep everything on the table when dealing with Iran. We should remember that Iran, like Iraq, is a third world nation without a significant military. Nothing in history hints that she is likely to invade a neighboring country, let alone do anything to America or Israel. I am concerned, however, that a contrived Gulf of Tonkin type incident may well occur to gain popular support for an attack on Iran. Even if such an attack is carried out by Israel over U.S. objections, we will be politically and morally culpable since we provided the weapons and the dollars to make it possible. Mr. Speaker, let's hope I'm wrong about this one.
How did the 20-year war get started? It had been long assumed that the United States government, shortly before Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, gave Saddam Hussein a green light to attack. A State Department cable recently published by WikiLeaks confirmed that U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie did indeed have a conversation with Saddam Hussein 1 week prior to Iraq's August 1st, 1990 invasion of Kuwait. Amazingly, the released cable was entitled Saddam's Message of Friendship to President Bush. In it, Ambassador Glaspie affirmed to Saddam that the president, this is in quotes, the president had instructed her to broaden and deepen our relations with Iraq, close quote. As Saddam Hussein outlined Iraq's ongoing border dispute with Kuwait, Ambassador Glaspie was quite clear that, quote, we took no position on these Arab affairs, close quote.
There would have been no reason for Saddam Hussein not to take this assurance at face value. The U.S. was quite supportive of his invasion and war of aggression against Iran in the 1980s. With this approval from the U.S. government, it wasn't surprising that the invasion occurred. The shock and surprise was how quickly the tables were turned and our friend Saddam Hussein all of a sudden became Hitler personified. The document was classified supposedly to protect national security, yet this information in no way jeopardized our security. Instead, it served to keep the truth from the American people about an event leading up to our initial military involvement in Iraq and the region that continues to today. The secrecy of the memo was designed to hide the truth from the American people and keep our government from being embarrassed. This was the initial event that had led to so much death and destruction, not to mention the financial costs these past 20 years. Our response and persistent militarism toward Iraq was directly related to 9/11, as our presence on the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular Saudi Arabia, was listed by al-Qaeda as a major grievance that outraged the radicals who carried out the heinous attacks against New York and Washington on that fateful day. Today, the conflict has spread through the Middle East and Central Asia with no end in sight. The reason this information is so important is that if Congress and the American people had known about this green light incident 20 years ago, they would have been a lot more reluctant to give a green light to our government to pursue the current war, a war that is ongoing and expanding to this very day. The tough question that remains is, was this done deliberately to create the justification to redesign the Middle East as many neoconservatives desired and to secure oil supplies for the West? Or was it just a diplomatic blunder followed up by many more strategic military blunders? Regardless, we have blundered into a war that no one seems willing to end. Julian Assange, the publisher of the WikiLeaks memo, is now considered an enemy of the state. Politicians are calling for drastic punishment and even assassination, and sadly, the majority of the American people seem to support such moves. But why should we so fear the truth? Why should our government's lies and mistakes be hidden from the American people in the name of patriotism? Once it becomes acceptable to equate truth with treason, we can no longer call ourselves a free society. Perpetual war is expensive. We've been militarily involved in the Persian Gulf region now for 20 years. Experts have predicted that the cost of this continuous and expanding war will reach $6 trillion. The hostilities and our overt involvement in Iraq can be dated back to January 16, 1991, when the defensive Operation Desert Shield became the offensive Operation Desert Storm. Though the end of the Persian Gulf War was declared on April 6, 1991 with a U.S. military victory, the 20-year war was just beginning. The U.S. and Britain have had an intense interest in controlling the oil of the Middle East dating back to the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. This interest expanded during World War II with FDR's promise to protect the puppet governments in the Persian Gulf region, especially Saudi Arabia. Though this arrangement never sat well with the citizens in the region, a fairly decent relationship remained between the Arab people and the American public. But animosity continued to build with our ever-present military involvement in Iraq. Our military assistance to the Mujahideen in the 1980s, now the Taliban, helped the Muslim defenders, one of whom was Osama bin Laden, oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. At that time, we were still not seen as occupiers, and the radical Muslims, encouraged by the U.S., were expected to direct all their efforts toward the communist threat. That all changed with the breakup of the Soviet system and the end of the Cold War, when, as the lone superpower left standing, we named ourselves the world policeman. It was then that the resentment by Arabs and Muslims became directed toward the United States, now seen as an invader and occupier. Continuous bombing and crippling sanctions against Iraq during the 1990s, the appearance that the U.S. did not care about the plight of the Palestinians, and our military bases in Saudi Arabia led to attention-getting attacks against the United States. The 1998 embassy attacks in Kenya and Tanzania and the attack of the U.S. Cole in the year 2000 were warnings that the war was far from over. The horrible tragedy of 9/11 shouldn't have been a surprise, and many believe it was preventable. Currently, the war has morphed into a huge battle for control of the Persian Gulf region and Central Asia. This involves Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Iran. Foolish policies lead to foolhardy conflicts. Foolhardy conflicts lead to unsustainable costs and a multitude of unintended consequences. To name a few, we have spent trillions of dollars based on the false pretense of defending freedom and our Constitution. The notion has been further solidified that war no longer needs to be declared by Congress and can be pursued as a prerogative of the President. We are now seen by the world not as a peacemaker, but rather a troublemaker and aggressor. Thousands of American service members have been killed and tens of thousands wounded, with a sharp increase in service-connected suicides. Over 500,000 veterans are seeking medical treatment and disability benefits. Millions of citizens have been killed, wounded, and displaced in the countries on the receiving end of our bombs, drones, sanctions, and occupation. The region has suffered huge environmental damage as a consequence of our military occupation. Christians from Iraq have suffered the worst rout in the history of Christendom. Iran and Iraq are now better allies than ever, with strong anti-American sentiment. Iraqi political stability is a joke. Ending hostilities in Afghanistan is a dream. China and Iran have been drawn into a closer alliance against the United States. America's uncontrolled deficits are senselessly fueled by needless militarism. We are now much poorer and less safe. There was no al-Qaeda in Iraq before we invaded in 2003. Today, there is. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found in Iraq. War always leads to government growth and the sacrifice of civil liberties. In the past 10 years, this has been particularly costly to us, with the acceptance of military tribunals, torture, assassination, abuse of habeas corpus, and Patriot Act-type legislation. Senseless war and senseless destruction and death should not be rationalized as providing a great service in protecting our freedoms, our Constitution, or maintaining peace. The only value that can come of this is to recognize that our policies are flawed and they need to be changed. Without this, history will record that the sacrifices were all in vain. I rise in opposition to this resolution, not because I am taking sides and picking who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, but I'm looking at this more from the angle of being a United States citizen, an American. And I think resolutions like this really do us great harm. In many ways, what's happening in the Middle East, and in particular with Gaza right now, we have some moral responsibility for both sides in a way, because we provide help and funding for both Arab nations and Israel. And so we definitely have a moral responsibility, and especially now today, the weapons being used to kill so many Palestinians are American weapons, and American funds essentially are being used for this. But there's a political liability which I think is something that we fail to look at, because too often there's so much blowback from our intervention in areas that we shouldn't be involved in. You know, Hamas, if you look at the history, you'll find out that Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel, because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat. And you say, well, yeah, that was better then and served its purpose, but we didn't want Hamas to do this. So then we as Americans say, well, we have such a good system, we're going to impose this on the world. We're going to invade Iraq and teach people how to be Democrats. We want free elections. So we encourage the Palestinians to have a free election. They do, and they elect Hamas. So we first, indirectly and directly through Israel, help establish Hamas. Then we have election. Then Hamas becomes dominant, so we have to kill them. You know, it just doesn't make sense. During the 80s, you know, we were allied with Osama bin Laden, and we were contending with the Soviets. It was at that time our CIA thought it was good if we radicalized the Muslim world. So we financed the madrasa schools to radicalize the Muslims in order to compete with the Soviets. There's too much blowback. There's a lot of reasons why we should oppose this resolution. It is not in the interest of the United States. It's not in the interest of Israel either. Today, the motion to instruct on the comprehensive Iranian sanction bill was passed overwhelmingly. 400 to 11. 11 individuals said that this was not a good idea. I was one of those 11. I'd like to explain why I think the sanction bill against the Iranians is very, very dangerous and not well thought out. Sanctions are very serious. Sanctions are literally an act of war. When you prevent certain goods and services going into a country, it's like a blockade. There's no advantage to us to do this. The sanction bill literally says that any country that trades or sends oil into Iran, we will no longer trade with them. So if Russia sends in oil or gasoline or refined products, or China does, we are theoretically under this bill not to trade with them. Can you think of anything more chaotic than having a trade war with China at this particular time? So often, well-intentioned foreign policy procedures backfire, they have unintended consequences, and there's too often blowback. Today, unbelievably, we are engaged in so many places in the world, and we can't afford it. Our foreign policy costs us $1 trillion a year to operate. We're in 135 countries. We have over 700 bases throughout the world. We are engaged in military confrontation in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. We're bombing in Yemen, and as well as having surrogates fighting in Somalia. We're flat out broke. The policy is driving our enemies into the hands of the Chinese, and here we are looking for another war. It makes no sense whatsoever. The conversation today was nothing more than war propaganda on why we have to get ready to bomb the Iranians. There is no proof, according to our CIA, that they're actually working on a nuclear weapon. Now, I'm sure they would like to. Why not? Everybody around them have it, so it would be logical that if they're surrounded and threatened and intimidated with all their people around them, why wouldn't they want one? Well, of course they do. But others have it. They have never been found in violation of the non-proliferation treaty. Never. And yet, Pakistan, India, and Israel, they don't even belong. And they're our friends, and we give them money. Pakistan, they get support from us. They have nuclear weapons, and they have been known to send nuclear technology to North Korea. So the whole process makes so little sense. The language today was used that, well, we have to go in because of the weapons of mass destruction. They're going to have missiles, and they're going to attack us. It's identical to the propaganda promoting in 2002 in 2001, before we attacked Iraq. So the same process is occurring. Try to generate all this excitement about the need to use hostilities. Now, a lot of individuals vote for sanctions that are basically anti-war, and they don't like the military option, and they think this is an alternative. I think that is deeply flawed thinking, because sanctions lead to hostilities. And if you commit to the sanctions, you're really committing to the next step. The sanctions of the 1990s and the year 2000, the sanctions on Iraq, eventually led to the hostilities and the war and the invasion. So what did that invasion of Iraq do? Did we find any al-Qaeda there? No, we found out that Saddam Hussein wouldn't allow the al-Qaeda there. No weapons of mass destruction. We've turned the country upside down, hundreds of thousands of people injured and killed. We have suffered devastating problems from this. And what has happened? We've turned the government of Iraq over to the Shiites, who are allies with the Iranians. So that whole policy has actually backfired. So now what we're doing to the Iranians is driving them into the pockets of the Chinese. The Chinese are pretty good capitalists these days. They work hard, they produce, they sell us goods and services, we pay them, they save their money, and they're starting to invest. So they're investing around the world in natural resources. And what are we doing? All we're doing is trying to take over the world with natural resources so we have control of oil. This is a mercantilistic idea. It's ancient, and it takes you back to almost colonial times. So this, I think, shows that our policies are deeply flawed. I sure would have wished this vote would have come out differently, and I warn, this was a very dangerous vote. Certainly in the last 24 hours, we've had a lot of discussion about Afghanistan and whether or not we should send more troops. Matter of fact, that debate's been going on for a long time. The whole debate about Afghanistan is something that makes me think that we're bogged down, considering the fact that it's been going on for 8 years. And this is not new for us. This is more or less the rule rather than the exception. And I believe this comes about because of the way we go to war. In the last 60-some years, we have never had a declaration of war, but we've been involved in plenty. We've been involved in Korea and Vietnam and Persian Gulf and Iraq War and now Afghanistan, and it looks like it's going to be Pakistan as well. So I think the reason we get here is because we don't declare war, and we slip into war, and then it becomes political. There are two sides. There's one side of the argument said, this just come home, and the other side says, fight it all out. But people say, no, you can't be an extremist on this. You have to have a balance, and the balance is chaotic. There's no sighting, there's no way of measuring victory, and nobody wants to give up, claiming this would be humiliating to give up. But just think of the tragedy of Vietnam, all those years and all those deaths and all that money spent. Eventually we left, and South Vietnam is now a unified country. But we still have troops in Korea and in Europe and in Japan, and we're bankrupt. So someday we're going to have to wake up and look at the type of foreign policy that the founders advised us to have, and that is non-intervention. Don't get involved in the internal affairs of other nations. Have free and open trade and accept friendship with other countries who offer it. And that we shouldn't be the policemen of the world. And we shouldn't be telling other people what to do. We cannot be the policemen of the world and pay for all these bills because we are literally bankrupt. In thinking about the dilemma that we have, I think back even back in the 1960s when I was an Air Force flight surgeon for 5 years, and that was the time when the first time I heard the term quagmire. And thinking about that for many, many years, that's all I can think about right now, is to evaluate what we have. And there's a few phrases that have been around for a long time, and I believe they more or less describe what's happening here. Quagmire, certainly that is what we're doing. We're digging a hole for ourselves. Perpetual war for perpetual peace. We've all heard that term, and it sounds like we are in perpetual war. War is the health of the state. We all know the government size and the sacrifice of civil liberties always occurs much more so in the midst of war. A book written many years ago by one of the most, if not the most decorated soldier we ever had, Smedley Butler. He wrote a book called War is a Racket. And I've come to this belief that war literally is a racket for the people who push these wars, whether it's the military-industrial complex or the special interests and the various factions, but it's never for the people. Today, it is said, that we're over there to protect our national security to go into Afghanistan. Well, it's down to 100 al-Qaedas in Afghanistan, and quite frankly, the Afghan government had nothing to do. They said they harbored the al-Qaeda, and that is true, but do you think those 19 guys needed to do push-ups in Afghanistan to come over here and do what they did? The real planning wasn't in Afghanistan. It was in Spain. It was in Germany. Where was the real training? The real training was in Florida. The training was in Florida, and the FBI had evidence at the time that they were being trained. It's totally ignored, and yet we're concentrating. We're still back to 9/11, fear of nuclear war. We have to go in, scare the people. And yet, what is the motivation for individuals to become radical against this, whether it's in the Taliban or al-Qaeda? There's one single factor that is the most influential in motivating somebody to commit suicide terrorism against anybody or us, and that is occupation by a foreign nation. And now, where are we occupied? We've occupied Iraq and Afghanistan. We're bombing Pakistan. But not only the literal occupation, but also we have this threat on Pakistan. So I would say it's time for us to reassess ourselves and look at a non-interventionist foreign policy. First off, I would like to address the subject about hostilities. It is true there are no armies facing each other, shooting and killing each other, no tanks, not those conventional type of hostilities, but we don't live in a conventional era and we don't fight conventional wars. But there's a lot of hostile action going on. In looking and checking to find out if anybody's been killed, the reports that I found, anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 Pakistanis have been killed. Now that sounds like it's rather hostile. And that comes not from our invasion and troop, but we've invaded them with our predators, with our drone missiles, and we drop bombs and we aim at targets, always at the bad people. But the best of my knowledge from the information I get is that 14 al-Qaeda leaders have been killed, and the rest have been civilians, and who knows exactly what their sentiments would be. Maybe a lot of them are defending their own country. Maybe they see that they don't like foreign occupiers. But there's a lot of hostile action going on, and a lot of people are dying. And the gentleman from Ohio is quite correct. If you check with the people of Pakistan, they don't want us there. They don't want bombs dropped on them. How would we react in this country if all of a sudden there was a drone missile that landed on one of our cities, then even if 1 or 2 or 3 Americans would kill? We would be outraged, and we'd want to know about it. And here we do it constantly. Where the real secrecy is, I complain that we don't know enough about it. We give up our prerogatives. We allow the presidents to do what they want, and then we just capitulate and give them the money and do whatever. But I argue we don't know enough. We don't assume our responsibility. The American people don't know about it until we get deep into these quagmires and into these messes. But what about in Pakistan? There's a lot of conniving going on there, because I am sure their leaders are quite satisfied, with us going in there, because we bribe them. We in the Congress just passed a bill that promises them $7.5 billion. So that's how they stay in power. And it's also how they can help the Taliban who's fighting us. The whole thing is such a mess. But the people, if you ask the people of Pakistan, they're not going to support this. And the argument is that we have to support this because our generals want us to, because this is our mission. Well, what is our mission? Our mission ought to be to defend this country, preserve liberty, and show people what a free society looks like. We shouldn't be trying to tell other people how to live with bombs and threats. We give them 2 options. We tell them, do it our way. And if they do, we give them a lot of money. If they don't do it our way, we start bombing them. But we don't achieve anything. That's my contention. We just go on and on. My big beef is the overall policy. I know we're talking about the technicalities and we're talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan, but we don't solve any of these technical problems until we deal with the subject of what kind of a foreign policy. Are we supposed to be the policemen of the world? Are we supposed to be in nation building? Are we supposed to bankrupt our people? Are we supposed to do infrastructure building all around the world and neglect all of ours? It's coming to an end because this country is bankrupt and we're going to have to change our policy whether we like it or not. In January 1991, we went to war in the Middle East against Saddam Hussein, Iraq's dictator who was our ally during the Iran-Iraq War. A border dispute between Kuwait and Iraq broke out after our State Department gave a green light to Hussein's invasion. After Iraq's successful invasion of Kuwait, we reacted with gusto and have been militarily involved in the entire region 6,000 miles from our shore ever since. This has included Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. After 20 years of killing and a couple $1 trillion wasted, not only does the fighting continue with no end in sight, but our leaders threaten to spread our bombs of benevolence on Iran. For most Americans, we are at war against a tactic called terrorism, not a country. This allows our military to go any place in the world without limits as to time or place. But how can we be at war? Congress has not declared war as required by the Constitution. That is true, but our presidents have, and Congress and the people have not objected. Congress obediently provides all the money requested for the war. People are dying. Bombs are dropped. Our soldiers are shot at and killed. Our soldiers wear uniform. Our enemies do not. They are not part of any government. They have no planes, no tanks, no ships, no missiles, and no modern technology. What kind of a war is this anyway, if it really is one? If it was a real war, we would have won it by now. Our stated goal since 9/11 has been to destroy al-Qaeda. Was al-Qaeda in Iraq? Not under Saddam Hussein. Our leaders lied us into invading Iraq and deceived us into occupying Afghanistan. There's still really no al-Qaeda in Iraq and only 100 or so in Afghanistan. And yet there is no end in sight to the war. Could there have been other reasons for this war that is not a war? Military victory in Afghanistan is elusive. Does anyone really know whom we are fighting and why? Why has the war not ended? 9 years and it continues to spread. Some claim it is to keep America safe, that our soldiers are fighting and dying for our freedom, defending our Constitution. Are we being lied to in order to keep us in this spreading war, just as we were lied to in the 1960s to keep us in Vietnam? We own the Iraq government as we do Afghanistan's. In Afghanistan, we are fighting the Taliban, those dangerous people with guns defending their homeland. Once they were called the Mujahideen, our old allies, along with Osama bin Laden, in the fight to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan in the 1980s. In that effort, our CIA funded radical jihad against those nasty foreign occupier, the Russians. What gratitude! Those same people now resent our benevolent occupation with a little violence thrown in. The resistance to our presence grows as our perseverance wanes. Our people are waking up, but our officials refuse to recognize the longer we stay, the greater is the support for those dedicated to the principle that Afghanistan is for Afghans who resent all foreign occupation. The harder we fight a war that is not a war, the weaker we get and the stronger becomes our enemy. When an enemy without weapons can resist an army of great strength, the most powerful of all history, one should ask, who has the moral high ground? Military failure in Afghanistan is to be our destiny. Changing generals without changing our policies or our policy makers perpetuates our agony and delays the inevitable. This is not a war that our generals have been trained for. nation building, police work, social engineering is never a job for foreign occupiers and never an appropriate job for soldiers trained to win wars. A military victory is no longer even a stated goal of our military leaders or our politicians, as they know that type of victory is impossible. The sad story is this war is against ourselves, our values, our Constitution, our financial well-being, and common sense. And at the rate we're going, it's going to end badly. What we need are honest leaders with character and a new foreign policy. I want to talk a little bit more about our policy because I said before that I think it's the policy that gets us into these predicaments, and that if you deal with this as a strictly technical, tactical problem that we have to face and how to rectify our problems, I don't think it will occur. I think we have to deal in the overall policy. In many ways, we follow a schizophrenic type of foreign policy because one time our best friends, they're our best friends, and then later on they become our worst enemies. This was true with Saddam Hussein. In the 80s, he was our friend, and we took care of him, and we sent him and encouraged him, supported his war. And then, of course, that changed. But even right before 9/11, the Taliban was still receiving money from us. And now they receive money from us indirectly. The Taliban gets money from the Pakistanis, or at least information as has been reported. But they literally get some of our money in the process, because in order for us to move equipment through Afghanistan, literally they end up getting American dollars doing this. So here we are going into Pakistan, and one of the arguments that go into Pakistan is that we have to go after the Taliban. That they're over there and they're organizing and they want to kill the American soldiers in Afghanistan. So this means that now they're our arch enemies. But the Taliban, especially in the 80s and the 90s, or in the 80s, they weren't called the Taliban, but they were called the Mujahideen, and it was a precursor. But they were our best friends, along with Osama bin Laden. And we were allies with them because we supported the principle that it was wrong for the Soviets to be occupying Afghanistan. But now the tables have turned, and now we're the occupiers, and now the very people that used to help us are now shooting and killing us. And now it's been revealed just recently with this release of information that they actually have some Stinger missiles. And it has, in the last month or so, 3 of our helicopters have been shot down. So where does this all end? One thing about the reports in the newspaper, I think if they change the definition or the use of one term, I think it would change everybody's attitude. If people came around to believing that the Taliban are people who aren't dedicated toward coming over here to kill us, like some of the Al-Qaeda are, but the Taliban are only interested in getting rid of the occupiers of their country. So we call them militant. So we go in and we raid and shoot and kill and bomb, and then we say, aha, we killed 37 militants today. What if we reported this always, like we did in the 80s? What if we always reported that freedom fighters were killed, as it was when they were our friends and our allies? The whole thing would change. But no, we call them militants and we call them insurgents, but they were formerly our allies and our so-called friends. So this is just a reflection on the ridiculousness of our endless policy of intervention, and how so often our allies and our friends turn against us, and how our money, taxpayers' money, so often is used against us. I think this is a perfect example. We'd like to stop it. That's why we brought this resolution up. We don't want to see this war spread, and we want the American people to know about it, and we want this Congress to know about it, because foreign policy isn't even written in the Constitution. The responsibility of how we run our foreign affairs is with the U.S. Congress, and when we go to the war, it should be a congressional function, not an executive function. And someday we may get there, but right now, today, we have to do our very best to let people know the shortcomings of the policy we're following in Pakistan.
I rise in opposition to this rule. It's been described rather vividly on this side of the aisle how messy this process is, so I strongly oppose this. Of course, I also strongly oppose the funding, especially for the funding for the war. This is a war that I've objected to for a very long time. This war is going badly. It's not a declared war. We don't have a precise enemy. The Taliban is the spoken enemy, and yet the Taliban are individuals who have never committed terrorism outside their homeland. The Taliban is an outgrowth of the Mujahideen, who once we were at one time allies with, along with Osama bin Laden. So it isn't a very neat little war. Here we are the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful army ever organized in the history of the world. And yet we are fighting a war that essentially is not a war. We're fighting a war against individuals that have no tanks, no planes, no ships, no modern technology, and we're not doing well. There's something wrong. If it were truly a war, a declared war, and we knew who the enemy was, the war would be over. The fact that the war is not over after 9 years, it's draining us of life and limb, it's draining us of funding. The wars in the Middle East have drained trillions of dollars, and we are suffering from a severe problem, financial crisis here at home. So it's time that we start looking abroad and looking at what we're trying to maintain. We're in over 130 countries, 900 bases. It's unsustainable. It was brought to attention this past week that we were having problems. If we were doing well in Afghanistan, we wouldn't be firing our generals. We want to put the blame on the generals. If we change the generals, everything is going to be okay. But our generals are trained to fight wars. They're not trained to be nation builders and social workers and policemen. So this is a war that I see is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to win until we change our policy.
I have a few questions for my colleagues. What if our foreign policy of the past century is deeply flawed and has not served our national security interests? What if we wake up one day and realize that the terrorist threat is a predictable consequence of our meddling in the affairs of others and has nothing to do with us being free and prosperous? What if propping up repressive regimes in the Middle East endangers both the United States and Israel? What if occupying countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and bombing Pakistan is directly related to the hatred directed toward us? What if someday it dawns on us that losing over 5,000 American military personnel in the Middle East since 9/11 is not a fair trade-off for the loss of nearly 3,000 American citizens, no matter how many Iraqi, Pakistani, and Afghan people are killed or displaced? What if we finally decide that torture, even if called enhanced interrogation technique, is self-destructive and produces no useful information, and that contracting it out to a third world nation is just as evil? What if it is finally realized that war and military spending is always destructive to the economy? What if all wartime spending is paid for through the deceitful and evil process of inflating and borrowing? What if we finally see that wartime conditions always undermine personal liberty? What if conservatives who preach small government wake up and realize that our interventionist foreign policy provides the greatest incentive to expand the government? What if conservatives understood once again that their only logical position is to reject military intervention and managing an empire throughout the world? What if the American people woke up and understood that the official reasons for going to war are almost always based on lies and promoted by war propaganda in order to serve special interests? What if we as a nation came to realize that the quest for empire eventually destroys all great nations? What if Obama has no intention of leaving Iraq? What if a military draft is being planned for the wars that will spread if our foreign policy is not changed? What if the American people learn the truth, that our foreign policy has nothing to do with national security, that it never changes from one administration to the next? What if war and preparation for war is a racket serving the special interests? What if President Obama is completely wrong about Afghanistan and it turns out worse than Iraq and Vietnam put together? What if Christianity actually teaches peace and not preventive wars of aggression? What if diplomacy is found to be superior to bombs and bribes in protecting America? What happens if my concerns are completely unfounded? Nothing. But what happens if my concerns are justified and ignored? Nothing good. Osama bin Laden applauded the 9/11 attacks. Such an act of deliberate killing of innocent lives deserves retribution. It is good that bin Laden is dead and justice served. Targeted retribution is far superior to wars of aggression and nation building. In 2001, I supported giving the President authority to punish those responsible for the vicious 9/11 attacks. Using this authority and opportunity to pursue nation building and remaking the Middle East was cynical and dangerous, as the past 10 years have proven. The sad tragedy is that it took 10 years, trillions of dollars, tens of thousands of American casualties, and many thousands of innocent lives to achieve our mission of killing one evil person. A narrow, targeted mission under these circumstances is far superior to initiating wars against countries not involved in the 9/11 attacks. This was the reason I emphasized at the time the principle of mark and reprisal, provided to us by the Constitution for difficult missions such as we faced. I'm convinced that this approach would have achieved our goal much sooner and much cheaper. The elimination of Osama bin Laden should now prompt us to bring our troops home from Afghanistan and Iraq. Al-Qaeda was never in Iraq, and we were supposedly in Afghanistan to get Osama bin Laden. With bin Laden gone, there's no reason for our presence in this region unless indeed it was all about oil, nation building, and remaking the Middle East and Central Asia. Hopefully bin Laden does not get the last laugh. He claimed the 9/11 attacks were designed to, number one, get America to spread its military dangerously and excessively throughout the Middle East, to cause political dissension within the United States. 70% of the American people now believe we should leave Afghanistan, yet both parties seem destined to stay. Number three, and to bankrupt America through excessive military spending as he did to the Soviets. The best thing we could do is prove bin Laden to be a false prophet. We must learn from this recent history. Tragically, one result may be the acceptance of torture as a legitimate tool for pursuing our foreign policy. A free society calling itself a republic should never succumb to such evil. Foreign aid to Pakistan, though bin Laden was safely protected for 10 years in Pakistan, should make us question the wisdom of robbing American citizens to support any government around the world with foreign aid. Our failed foreign policy is reflected in our bizarre relationship with Pakistan. We bomb them with our drones, causing civilian casualties. We give them billions of dollars in foreign aid, and she protects America's enemy number one, bin Laden, for a decade. It's time to consider a sensible, non-interventionist foreign policy as advised by our founders and authorized by our Constitution. We would all be better off for it. The question we're facing today is, should we leave Afghanistan? I think the answer is very clear, and it's not complicated. And of course, we should, as soon as we can. This suggests that we can leave by the end of the year. If we don't, we'll be there for another decade, would be my prediction. The American people are now with us.
A group of us here in the Congress, bipartisan group, for nearly a decade have been talking about this, arguing not to expand the war, not to be over there, not to be a nation building, and the American people didn't pay much attention. Now they are. The large majority of the American people now say it's time to get out of Afghanistan. It's a fruitless venture. Too much has been lost. The chance of winning, since we don't even know what we're going to win, doesn't exist. So they are tired of it. Financially, there's a good reason to come home as well. Some argue we have to be there because if we leave under these circumstances, we'll lose face. It will look embarrassing to leave. So how many more men and women have to die? How many more dollars have to be spent to save face? That is one of the worst arguments possible. We're not there under legal conditions. This is a war. Who says it isn't a war? Everybody talks about the Afghan war. Was the war declared? Of course not. It wasn't declared. There was a resolution passed that said that the president at that time, under the emergency of 9/11, could go and deal with al-Qaeda, those who dealt and brought upon the 9/11 bombings. But al-Qaeda is not there anymore, so we're fighting the Taliban. The Taliban used to be our allies at one time when the Soviets were there. Taliban wants, their main goal is to keep foreign occupationers out. They want foreigners out of their country. They're not al-Qaeda. Yet most Americans, maybe less so now, but the arguments here on the floor is we got to go after al-Qaeda. This is not a war against al-Qaeda. If anything, it gives the incentive for al-Qaeda to grow in numbers rather than dealing with them. You know, the money issue, we're talking about a lot of money. Huh? How much do we spend in a year? Probably about $130 billion, up to $1 trillion now in this past decade. Later on in the day, we're going to have two votes. We're going to have a vote on doing something sensible, making sense out of our foreign policy, bringing our troops home, and saving hundreds of billions of dollars. And then we also will have a vote against NPR, to cut the funding of NPR. There is a serious question about whether that will even cut one penny, but at least the fiscal conservatives are going to be overwhelmingly in support of slashing NPR, go home and brag about how they're so great fiscal conservatives, and the very most they might save is $10 million. And that's their claim to fame for slashing the budget. At the same time, they won't consider for a minute cutting a real significant amount of money. All empires end for fiscal reasons because they spread themselves too far around the world, and that's what we're facing. We're in the midst of a military conflict that's contributing to this inevitable crisis, and it's financial. And you'd think there'd be a message in the fact of how did the Soviets come down? By doing the very same thing that we're doing, perpetual occupation of a country. We don't need to be occupying Afghanistan or any other country. We don't even need to be considered going into Libya and where else. Fortunately, I guess for those of us who would like to see less of this killing, we will have to quit because we won't be able to afford it. The process that we're going through is following the War Powers Resolution. This is a proper procedure. It's call attention to how we slip into these wars. I have always claimed that it's the way we get into the wars that are the problem. If we would be precise and only go to war with a declaration of war, get with the people behind us, knowing who the enemy is, and fight, win, and get it over with, that would be more legitimate. They don't do it now because the American people wouldn't support it. Nobody's going to declare war against Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya. So we now have been so careless for the past 50 or 60 years that we have, as a Congress and especially a House, we have reneged on our responsibilities. We have avoided our prerogatives of saying that we have the control. We have the control of the purse. We have control of when we're supposed to go to war, and yet the wars continue. They never stop. And yet we are going to be completely brought down to our knees. We can't change Afghanistan. People who are bragging about these changes, you know, even if you could, you're not supposed to. You don't have the moral authority. You don't have the constitutional authority. So I would say, the sooner, the sooner.
Give him 30 more seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 more seconds.
I would say the sooner the better. We can come home. This process says come home. Under the law, it says you should start bringing troops home within 30 days. This allows up to the end of the year after this would be passed. But this needs to be done, and a message needs to be sent. And someday we have to wake up and say, if you are a fiscal conservative, you ought to look at the waste. This is military Keynesianism to believe that we should do this forever. So I would say this is the day to be on record and vote for this resolution.
The important question being asked today with regards to foreign policy is, should the United States impose a no-fly zone over Libya? There are leaders in both sides of Congress and leaders on both parties who are now advising this, as well as individuals in the administration. It is my opinion that we should not. It would be foolish. It would have a downside, and we should think very, very carefully before we go expanding the wars that we're already involved in. We're in two major wars with Iraq and Afghanistan, and that involves Pakistan and Yemen already. So to go into Libya now and impose a no-fly zone, we have to remember a no-fly zone is an act of war. Now, what moral right do we have to participate in war activity against Libya? Libya hasn't done anything to the United States. They're not a threat to our national security. There's been no aggression. There's no constitutional authority for a president to willy-nilly go and start placing no-fly zones over countries around the world. And, you know, we tried this in the 1990s and did it for 8 or 9 years. We had a no-fly zone along with sanctions and blockades around Iraq. And finally it ended up a war, and the wars were based on lies. And then when that happened, they said, yes, but it was well worth it because we got rid of a bad guy. But we also lost close to 4,500 American military people, 30-some thousand severe injuries, hundreds of thousands applying now for disability, because we went to war when we shouldn't have gone to war. And to expand this war now makes no sense whatsoever. It's against international law. It challenges the War Powers Resolution. And for that reason, we should stop and think. Congress should act. I'm proposing to, preparing to introduce a resolution next week as a sense of Congress that the executive branch can't do this without approval from the Congress. Why should we do this? Do you think it'll cost some money? Yes, it's going to cost a ton of money. And it's going to have, innocent people will be killed. You can't just all of a sudden turn a switch and say don't fly over Libya. You have to bomb a lot of anti-aircraft sites and a lot of military establishment. So the war is on. And from my viewpoint, this is the kind of thing that's been going on too long. It contributes significantly to our bankruptcy, and we are now spending approximately $1 trillion a year maintaining our empire around the world. We are in the process of remaking all the borders and leadership in Middle East and Central Asia, and now North Africa we get involved. We had invested $70 billion trying to prop up a dictator in Egypt, and look how that ended up. Now we're hustling around to find out who the next dictator is. So if we get involved, I'm not sure they even know who to bomb and why, which one, and who's going to come out on top. That is an internal matter. It's a civil war that's going on, and we can cheer for one side or the other, but that is not a justification to place the burden on the American people, both militarily and individualized as well as monetarily. Now, some would say that, yes, that sounds good, I agree with you that, but as long as we get approval from the UN and NATO, it'll be okay. But, you know, that's just really a cop-out. What Army and Air Force and technology does the UN have, and what does NATO have? You get a resolution in the UN and say, well, let's take out this bad guy and do these things, or NATO does it. They're all our airplanes, and they're all our money, and no matter what, anything and everything that goes wrong, the United States will be blamed for it. And there's enough resentment against us already for pretending that we can tell every other country how to live. The best way to look at this, I believe, is how would we as a people and how would we as a Congress respond if we were a weaker nation and there was a stronger nation, that they came and imposed no-fly zone over us, or had sanctions against us, or had a blockade. We wouldn't accept that. That would unify us. So I don't buy into this thing that this is the only humanitarian thing that we can do is expand the war. If we want to do something for humanity, we need a new foreign policy. We need a foreign policy that isn't built on militarism. It's built on more cooperation and more trade and not picking our dictators. Look at what happened after we picked the dictator for Iran. It lasted, sure, 25 years or so, but eventually it radicalized the Islamists and they had a revolution, and we came out on the short end of that. So I think it's time that we reassess this and think about a policy that makes a lot more sense than economically we need to do it.
I rise in support of this rule, although I have a lot of complaints about how we deal with the issue of war. This is a debate that should have gone on 4 months ago before the war was started, and if we'd have done this properly, we wouldn't be bringing this up quickly. No committee work, no discussion, no chance for amendment. But nevertheless, I will support the rule because at least we get a chance to talk a little bit about what's going on in Libya. We have two resolutions that will come up under this rule. The first resolution, generally I understand most individuals aren't too keen on this because it's a literal endorsement. It's a rather explicit endorsement of the war, and I obviously would be opposed to H.J. Res. 68. But my greatest concern is about H.R. 2278, because the way I read this resolution is that it essentially grants the same authority that we grant in the first one, because we say that, oh no funds can be used, deny the use of funds, but how can you deny the use of appropriated funds when they're using funds that weren't appropriated? It's so redundant. The funds were never appropriated, so yes, it's a good statement. No funds, you don't continue to be illegal is what we're saying. But what I'm concerned about are the exceptions. All the exceptions are for the things that they're doing, you know, like search and rescue, intelligence gathering, renaissance, surveillance, refueling, operations planning, and doing everything except pull the trigger. So we're legalizing that. I believe that H.R. 2278 is the first time that we in the Congress are making a statement that we are granting authority to the President to pursue this particular war. So I am in strong opposition to that resolution as well, although I understand the other side of the argument because it says denial of funds. But, you know, the resolution actually says that, you know, the main reason, the author of the resolution said, the reason why we have the exception is to protect the integrity of our contract or agreement with NATO. Well, in the resolution said we have to stop the funding because we don't want to support NATO's war. So it's totally inconsistent, makes no sense whatsoever, but it reminds me of the War Powers Resolution. You know, after the Vietnam War, we didn't want to get into that kind of war anymore, so they come along to Congress, and its infinite wisdom is, with great good intentions, designs the War Power Resolution, which legalized war for 90 days. That's part of the reason why we're here. We're worrying about 90 days, but here we're going into the 4th month dealing with the War Powers Resolution. There's a simple solution to all of this, and that is obey the Constitution, don't allow our presidents to go to war without a declaration of war, and we wouldn't be facing this problem of this debate that actually gets a little bit silly on restraining the president. Yes, we should exert ourselves. We have the prerogatives, we have the obligations,
time has
and we have avoided it. It's time to stand up for the rule of law. And I rise in strong support for H.Con. Res. 51. We need to pass this resolution to send a very strong message. We have been told by those who oppose this message that we should not have an abrupt withdrawal from the region. But I would strongly suggest that what we should be talking about is the abrupt and illegal entry into war. That's what we have to stop. Since we went in abruptly and illegally, we need to abruptly leave. It has also been said by those who oppose this resolution that they concede that the Congress should assume their prerogatives over the war powers, but do it gradually. I would strongly suggest that when we took our oath of office, we assumed that radically and suddenly. We took an oath of office to obey the Constitution, not defer to the United Nations, and that we already have assumed that responsibility. And I would also suggest, if we do nothing, if we do not pass this resolution, it is the sin of omission that we commit. Mr. Speaker, later this morning we will be debating and voting on two resolutions dealing with Libya. The first one, H.J. Res. 68, has been said to be one that literally endorses exactly what the President has been doing, and I agree with that. Even though it excludes ground troops, it doesn't talk about special forces, CIA, contractors, and unlimited bombing, which is really what we have to restrict. But the second one, H.R. 2278, has been said to be more strongly worded in restraint on the President, and this is where I disagree. I believe the wording is different, and it says no funds for ground troops, but then it has exceptions, and the exceptions are for all the things that we're already doing. So I believe if we vote and pass the second one, it will be the first time this Congress has given authority to the President for what he is doing right now. So I urge my colleagues to look at both of these carefully. I have concluded that not only should the first one be voted down, but it's very important that the second one be voted down as well.
My topic for this evening is assassinations. What have we allowed ourselves to become? Are we no longer a nation of laws? Have we become instead a nation of men who make secret arrests? Are secret prisons now simply another tool of the federal government law enforcement? Is secret rendition of individuals now permitted out of misplaced fear? Have we decided that the writ of habeas corpus is not worth defending? Is torture now an acceptable tool for making us safe? Unfortunately, the single answer to all of these questions from the leaders of our country and to many of our citizens appears to be yes. And now we are told that assassination of foreigners as well as American citizens is legitimate and necessary to provide security for our people. It is my firm opinion that nothing could be further from the truth. Secret arrests, secret renditions, torture, and assassinations are illegal under both domestic and international law. These activities should be anathema to the citizens of a constitutional republic. The real threat doesn't arise from our failure to torture. Rather, desensitizing our nation to the willful neglect and sacrifice of our civil liberties fought and died for over the centuries is the threat. The concept of habeas corpus existed even before King John of England was forced in 1215 by his rebellious barons to sign the Magna Carta. This basic principle and expression of individual liberty, which has survived 800 years, greatly influenced the writing of our Constitution and our common law heritage. Today, we hardly hear a whimper, either from the American people or a stone-silent U.S. government as our cherished liberties are eradicated. Instead, we have a government that deliberately orchestrates needless fear and makes people insecure enough to ignore the reality of their lost liberties. The latest outrage is the current administration's acknowledgement that we now have a policy that permits assassination not only of foreign suspects, but of American citizens as well. Of course, the CIA has used secret assassinations in a limited fashion for decades, despite international, domestic, and moral law. When done secretly, as in the past, our government at least recognized that assassination was illegal and wrong. Frighteningly and astonishingly, however, the policy is now explicit. National Intelligence Director Dennis Blair, in open testimony before the House Intelligence Committee on February 3rd of this year, acknowledged that American citizens can indeed be assassinated at our government's discretion. The U.S. government attempted to assassinate Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen without even charging him with a crime. We're told this evidence is secret, that he does not deserve any constitutional rights and that some unknown individual in the administration has the authority to declare him a threat and therefore a legitimate target for assassination. Yes, I know he is probably a very bad person. Yes, I know that only a few Americans are on the assassination hit list. Yes, I know that artificially generated fear makes a large number of Americans inclined to applaud this effort, which supposedly will make us safe. But if this becomes standard operating procedure and a permanent precedent is established, let me assure you that this abuse of the law will spread. It's time for Congress and the American people to wake up to the realities of the dangers we face. We must remember as members of Congress that we have taken an oath to protect and defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. It should not be that difficult to distinguish the difference between the danger posed by the underwear bomber and the danger posed by a government that endorses secret prisons, torture, and assassinating American citizens.
The last nail is being driven into the coffin of the American Republic, yet Congress remains in total denial as our liberties are rapidly fading before our eyes. The process is propelled by unwarranted fear and ignorance as to the true meaning of liberty. It is driven by economic myths, fallacies, and irrational good intentions. The rule of law is constantly rejected, and authoritarian answers are offered as panaceas for all our problems. Runaway welfareism is used to benefit the rich at the expense of the middle class. Who would have ever thought that the current generation and Congress would stand idly by and watch such a rapid disintegration of the American Republic? Characteristic of this epic event is the casual acceptance by the people and the political leaders of the unitary presidency, which is equivalent to granting dictatorial powers to the president. Our presidents can now, on their own, order assassinations, including American citizens, operate secret military tribunals, engage in torture, enforce indefinite imprisonments without due process, order searches and seizures without proper warrants, gutting the Fourth Amendment, ignore the 60-day rule for reporting to the Congress the nature of any military operation as required by the War Powers Resolution, continue the Patriot Act abuses without oversight, wage war at will, treat all Americans as suspected terrorists at airports with TSA groping and nude x-raying. And the Federal Reserve accommodates by counterfeiting the funds needed and not paid for by taxation and borrowing, permitting runaway spending, endless debt, and special interest bailouts. And all of this is not enough. The abuses and usurpations of the war power are soon to be codified in the National Defense Authorization Act, now rapidly moving its way through Congress. Instead of repealing the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, as we should, now that bin Laden is dead and gone, Congress is planning to massively increase the war power of the president. Though an opportunity presents itself to end the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, Congress, with bipartisan support, obsesses on how to expand the unconstitutional war power of the president he already holds. The current proposal would allow a president to pursue war anytime, any place, for any reason, without congressional approval. Many believe this would even permit military activity against American suspects here at home. The proposed authority does not reference the 9/11 attacks. It would be expanded to include the Taliban and associated forces, a dangerously vague and expansive definition of our potential enemies. There is no denial that the changes in Section 1034 totally eliminates the hard-fought-for restraint on presidential authority to go to war without congressional approval achieved at the Constitutional Convention. Congress's war authority has been severely undermined since World War II, beginning with the advent of the Korean War, which was fought solely under a UN resolution. Even today, we're waging war in Libya without even consulting with the Congress, similar to how we went to war in Bosnia in the 1990s under President Clinton. The three major reasons for our constitutional conventions were to guarantee free trade and travel among the states, make gold and silver legal tender, and abolish paper money, and strictly limit the executive branch's authority to pursue war without congressional approval. But today, Federal Reserve notes are legal tender, gold and silver are illegal. The Interstate Commerce Clause is used to regulate all commerce at the expense of the free trade among the states. And now, the final nail is placed in the coffin of congressional responsibility for the war power, delivering this power completely to the President, a sharp and huge blow to the concept of our republic. In my view, it appears that the fate of the American Republic is now sealed, unless these recent trends are quickly reversed. The saddest part of this tragedy is that all these horrible changes are being done in the name of patriotism and protecting freedom. They are justified by good intentions while believing the sacrifice of liberty is required for our safety. Nothing could be further from the truth. More sadly is the conviction that our enemies are driven to attack us for our freedoms and prosperity, and not because of our deeply flawed foreign policy that has generated justifiable grievances and has inspired the radical violence against us. Without this understanding, our endless, unnamed, and undeclared wars will continue, and our wonderful experiment with liberty will end.
I rise in opposition to this bill. I was opposed to the Patriot Act in 2001 and do not believe now that it's a good idea to extend it. You know, the Fourth Amendment is rather clear. It says that we should be secure in our papers, our persons, our homes, and our effects. And that if warrants are to be issued, we have to do it with probable cause and describe in particular the places, the people, and the things that we're going to look at. And I think what has happened, though, over the years has been that we have diluted the Fourth Amendment. It was greatly diluted in 2001, but it started a lot earlier than that. When the FISA law was originally written in 1978, that really introduced the notion that the Fourth Amendment was relative and not absolute. And later on, it was further weakened in 98 and then, of course, in 2001. I think our reaction to the horrors of 9/11, we can understand the concern and the fear that was developed, but I think the reaction took us in the wrong direction, because the assumption was made, of course, that we weren't spending enough money on surveillance, and even though then our intelligence agencies received $40 billion, they didn't give us the right information. So now we're spending $80 billion. But it also looks like the conclusion was that the American people had too much privacy. And if we undermine the American people's privacy, somehow or another, we're going to be safer. I think another thing that has come up lately has been that the purpose of government is to make us perfectly safe. Now, it is good to be safe, but governments can't make us safe. I question whether or not we have been made safer by the Patriot Act. But let's say a law makes us somewhat safer. Is that a justification for the government to do anything they want? For instance, if you want to be perfectly safe from child abuse and wife beating, the government could put a camera in every one of our houses and our bedrooms, and maybe there would be somebody made safer this way, but what would you be giving up? So perfect safety is not the purpose of government. What we want from government is to enforce the law and to protect our liberties. This, to me, has been, especially since 9/11, a classical example of sacrificing liberty for safety and security. Now, I didn't invent those terms. They've been around a long time, and it's easily justified, and I can understand it because I was here in 2001 when this came up, and people become frightened. The American people want something done, but I think this is misdirected and not it doesn't serve our benefits. So I think at this time we should really question why we're extending this. We're extending the three worst parts. Why were these sunsetted? Because people had concern about them. They weren't sure they were good pieces, and maybe they were overkill, and therefore they were saying we better reassess it. So what have we done? We have already extended it twice, and here we're going to do it again with the intent, I think, in a year to reassess this. But this bill doesn't make things worse. It doesn't make anything better, but it does extend what I consider and others consider bad legislation. I ask for a no vote on this legislation. I rise this evening to announce that I introduced some legislation today dealing with the calamity that we have found at our airports with TSA. Something has to be done. Everybody's fed up. The people are fed up. The pilots are fed up. I'm fed up. You know, I've come to this floor many times over the past many years and complained about the terrible foreign policy we've had, the terrible monetary policy we had, the excessive spending and the debt, and also the tax policy. But what we're doing and what we're accepting and putting up with at this airport is so symbolic of us just not standing up and saying enough is enough. I know the American people are starting to wake up, but our government, those in charge, Congress as well as the executive branch, are doing nothing. Yes, they're talking about maybe backing off and allowing the pilots go through. But can you think how silly the whole thing is? The pilot has a gun in the cockpit, and he's managing this aircraft, which is a missile, and we make him go through this groping X-ray exercise, having people feel in their underwear. It's absurd. And it's time we wake up. The bill I've introduced will take care of this. But we have to realize that the real problem is that the American people have been too submissive. We have been too submissive. It's been going on for a long time. And this was to be expected even from the beginning of the TSA. And it's deeply flawed. Private property should be protected by private individuals, not bureaucrats. But the bill that I've introduced will take care of it. It's very simple. It's one paragraph long. It removes the immunity from anybody in the federal government that does anything that you or I can't do. If you can't grope another person, and if you can't X-ray people and endanger them with possible X-ray, you can't take nude photographs of individuals, why do we allow the government to do it? We would go to jail if an individual, he'd be immediately arrested if an individual citizen went up and did these things, and yet we just sit there and calmly say, oh, they're making us safe. And besides, the argument from the executive branch is that when you buy a ticket, you have sacrificed your rights, and it's the duty of the government to make us safe. That isn't the case. You never have to sacrifice your rights. The duty of the government is to protect our rights, not to use them and do what they have been doing to us. The pilots, hopefully, will be exempted from this. But another suggestion I have that might help us, let's make sure that every member of Congress goes through this. Get the X-ray, take a look, and make them look at the pictures, and then go through one of those groping pat-downs. And then I think there'd be a difference. Have everybody in the executive branch, anybody a cabinet member, make them go through it and look at it. Maybe they would pay more attention. But it doesn't work. This is not what makes us safer. This is preposterous to think that the TSA has made us safer. When you think about it, if you look at what's happened over the past 10 years, during this last decade, we lost 3,000 on a terrible, terrible day for America. But since that time, in this last decade, we have also lost 6,000 of our military personnel going over there and trying to rectify this problem. We have lost 400,000 people on our government-run highways. We have lost 150,000 individuals from homicides. So I think there's reason to be concerned, reason to deal with this problem. We're not dealing with it the right way. We're doing the wrong thing. And groping people at the airport doesn't solve our problems. What has solved our problems basically has been that they put a good lock on the door and they put a gun inside the cockpit. That's been the greatest boon to our safety. Safety should be the responsibility of the individual and the private property owner. But right now, we assume the government's always going to take care of us, and we are supposed to sacrifice our liberties. I say that is wrong. We are not safer, and we also know there are individuals who are making money off this. Michael Chertoff. I mean, here's a guy that was the head of the TSA selling the equipment, and the equipment's questionable. We don't even know if it works, and it may well be dangerous to our health. The way I see this, if this doesn't change, I see what has happened to the American people is we have accepted the notion that we should be treated like cattle. Make us safe, make us secure, put us in the barbed wire, feed us, fatten us up, and then they'll eat us. And we're a bunch of cattle, and we have to wake up and say, we've had it. I think this whole idea of an opt-out day is just great. We ought to opt out and make the point, get somebody to watch it, take a camera. It's time for the American people to stand up, shrug off the shackles of our government at TSA at the airport. WikiLeaks' release of classified information has generated a lot of attention worldwide in the past few weeks. The hysterical reaction makes one wonder if this is not an example of killing the messenger for the bad news. Despite what is claimed, information so far released, though classified, has caused no known harm to any individual, but it has caused plenty of embarrassment to our government. Losing a grip on our empire is not welcomed by the neoconservatives in charge. There is now more information confirming that Saudi Arabia is a principal supporter and financier of al-Qaeda, and this should set off alarm bells since we guarantee its Sharia-run government. This emphasizes even more the fact that no al-Qaeda existed in Iraq before 9/11, and yet we went to war against Iraq based on the lie that it did. It has been charged by self-proclaimed experts that Julian Assange, the internet publisher of this information, has committed a heinous crime deserving prosecution for treason and execution or even assassination. But should we not at least ask how the U.S. government can charge an Australian citizen with treason for publishing U.S. secret information that he did not steal? And if WikiLeaks is to be prosecuted for publishing classified documents, why shouldn't the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others that have also published these documents be prosecuted? Actually, some in Congress are threatening this as well. The New York Times, as a result of a Supreme Court ruling, was not found guilty in 1971 for the publication of the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg never served a day in prison for his role in obtaining these secret documents. The Pentagon Papers were also inserted into the congressional record by Senator Mike Gravel, with no charges being made of breaking any national security laws. Yet the release of this classified information was considered illegal by many, and those who lied us into the Vietnam War and argued for its prolongation were outraged. But the truth gained from the Pentagon Papers revealed that lies were told about the Gulf of Tonkin attack, which perpetuated a sad and tragic episode in our history. Just as with the Vietnam War, the Iraq War was based on lies. We were never threatened by weapons of mass destruction or al-Qaeda in Iraq, though the attack on Iraq was based on this false information. Any information that challenges the official propaganda for the war in the Middle East is unwelcome by the administration and supporters of these unnecessary wars. Few are interested in understanding the relationship of our foreign policy and our presence in the Middle East to the threat of terrorism. Revealing the real nature and goal of our presence in so many Muslim countries is a threat to our empire, and any revelation of this truth is highly resented by those in charge. Questions to consider. Do the American people deserve to know the truth regarding the ongoing war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen? Number two, could a larger question be, how can an Army private gain access to so much secret information? Number three, why is the hostility mostly directed at Assange, the publisher, and not our government's failure to protect classified information? Number four, are we getting our money's worth from the $80 billion per year we spend on intelligence gathering? Number five, which has resulted in the greatest number of deaths? Lying us into war, or WikiLeaks revelations, or the release of the Pentagon Papers? If Assange can be convicted of a crime for publishing information that he did not steal, what does this say about the future of the First Amendment and the independence of the Internet? Number seven, could it be that the real reason for the near universal attacks on WikiLeaks is more about secretly maintaining a seriously flawed foreign policy of empire than it is about national security? Number eight, is there not a huge difference between releasing secret information to help the enemy in a time of declared war, which is treason, and the releasing of information to expose our government lies that promote secret wars, death, and corruption. Number 9, was it not once considered patriotic to stand up to our government when it's wrong? Thomas Jefferson had it right when he advised, "Let the eyes of vigilance never be closed." I rise today to talk a bit about our economy and the marketplace, which, if anybody has observed, is in shambles. A couple years ago, we had a financial crisis, basically a bit of problems and debt with the financial institutions, the banks, and a lot of corporations. And that was a rather hectic period of time, but I think what we're moving into now is much, much more serious. And what I see happening is that this is not a financial problem as much as a currency problem. Everybody knows there are major problems in Greece right now because of the debt load that they have and they cannot finance, and nobody's there at the moment to bail them out. But a lot has been happening. And I've been interested in this subject for a long time. Matter of fact, in 1971, with the breakdown of the Bretton Woods Agreement, I became fascinated with economics and politics. At that time, there was a devaluation of the dollar of 3.5%, 3.8%, and it was very, very big news. And that's when the dollar was connected to gold, and there was a devaluation against gold. And this was a major event and ushered in a major amount of inflation in the 1970s. And yet, this process continues. Matter of fact, the breakdown in 1971 opened up the doors to massive inflation, and that's what we have been doing for 35, 40 years, of inflating the currency, creating many and multiple financial bubbles which have burst and have given us a great deal of trouble. But a currency crisis is much worse because people lose confidence in the dollar. Now, I have talked a lot about the value of the dollar, and somebody might wonder exactly why I would come today and talk about a concern I have for the value of the dollar, because if you look at the dollar is a haven. The dollar has been going up sharply in terms of other international currencies. And they would say that this is a haven, it's still strong, people are buying our treasury bills. But I still argue the case that there is a currency crisis going on, because if you look at the one true money, the one money that has existed for 6,000 years, that outlasts all the paper money and all the fiat currency, and that is gold. And it doesn't look very good, and it's sending a signal that a lot of inflation lurks in the future. In the past several years, maybe even 10 or 15 years, the dollar and the gold relationship depended on gold acting as a commodity. It moved with the stock market. It moved with commodity prices. But no longer. Instead of the gold going down when the stocks went down, and instead of the gold going down when the commodities go down, instead of the gold going down when the dollar goes up, all of a sudden, people are resorting to putting dollars and other currencies in gold. This is sending a signal that the confidence is being lost in the entire fiat monetary system. And the dollar, of course, is the reserve currency of the world, and therefore a very significant event. But there are even other statistics to suggest that we're in for a lot more inflation. If we look at what has happened to producer prices in the past 12 months, we find out that producer prices have already moved up significantly. For instance, finished consumer goods are up 8.2% in the last 12 months. Finished consumer goods, excluding food, are up 8.3%. Finished energy goods are up 20%. Now, that has not yet affected the consumer price index, but in the months to come, the producer prices will move into the consumer products, so we can expect a lot more inflation. Now, the way we get into this trouble is due to accepting some notions about money that are false. We have believed since 1971 that there should be no linkage of our money to anything sound as the Constitution mandates. There should be no linkage of the dollar to gold or silver, which then gives the Congress the leeway of spending endlessly. Deficits don't matter. We can tax and we can borrow, but if we still don't have enough money, we can depend on the Federal Reserve just to print the money. Now, that has lasted for a long time, and we've been getting away with it, but the market is more powerful than the central bank and the politicians. The market usually rules, and they come and say, the money isn't worth what it used to be, and there's too much malinvestments, too much debt, and therefore a correction must occur. This happened with the financial situation. There had to be a correction. The bubble burst, and there are some adjustments. But everything that we have done over these past several years and even over the last several decades, it's always been to resort to more inflation, print more money, spend more money, which only produces a problem that delays the inevitable. What I am afraid is the inevitable is here, and we must do something about it.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased that the Constitution has received a lot of attention in recent weeks, thanks to the Tea Party movement. It goes without saying that members of Congress should have read the Constitution many times, and we should continue to study it. Citing the particular clause of the Constitution that authorizes newly introduced legislation is a reasonable suggestion, yet in reality it will do little to restrain unconstitutional growth of federal government. We've had such rules in the past, and no benefit came of it. The laws that are passed reflect the preferences of those in charge who promote their personal agenda. For too long, that agenda has expanded government at the expense of personal liberty, regardless of which party was in charge. Generally, this trend was supported by voters who rewarded most members of Congress with re-election. For many of us, this expansion of government clearly violated the Constitution, yet it was always argued that the program somehow conformed to that living document. By misinterpreting the General Welfare Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress has justified every conceivable expansion of the federal government. Congress also has misinterpreted the 14th Amendment and legislated as though it had repealed the 10th Amendment. Sadly, Congress has systematically abdicated its prerogatives and responsibilities to the executive branch over many decades. Too many people in and out of Congress grew up being taught that the Constitution was malleable. This has allowed judicial, legislative, and executive flexibility to make the Constitution a modern living document. Though the authors allowed for flexibility through the amendment process, this process has been ignored for the sake of speed and convenience. As a result, the Constitution now has little meaning, since most members pay only lip service when taking their oath to obey it. But I am encouraged by a growing grassroots interest in the Constitution, especially among the younger generation. I'm glad Congress is becoming aware of it. Our Constitution should be viewed as law, and members of Congress should be expected to follow the rule of law. But a document is just that, and it is only as good as the character of those who represent us and promise to obey it. Distorted interpretations come easily when the goal is opposite of what the original authors intended and what the plain text provides. If true liberty is not our goal, persistent efforts to rationalize misinterpretations and circumvent the Constitution will continue. Without men and women of character in Congress, respect for the rule of law, and a love of liberty, the Constitution becomes but a worthless piece of paper. Celebrating the Constitution without this understanding will do nothing to restore the greatness of America. Simply praising the document distracts from the need for members to gain the courage to resist special interests, political self-interest, emergency needs in times of crisis, fear-based economic myths, and the persistent temptation to seek security over liberty while ignoring personal responsibility and self-reliance. Providing instruction in the Constitution for staff and/or members begs the question, who will be the teacher? I wonder, will this welcome renewed interest in the Constitution lead to a healthy reassessment of all our policies? Will there be no more wars without an actual congressional declaration? Will the Federal Reserve Act be repealed? Will only gold and silver be called legal tender? Will we end all the unconstitutional federal departments, including the Department of Energy, Education, Agriculture, Commerce, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, and Labor? Will the Patriot Act be repealed and all the warrantless searches stopped? Will TSA be restrained or abolished? Will the IRS's unconstitutional collection powers end? Will executive and judicial quasi-legislative powers be ended? Will we end the federal war on drugs? Will we end the federal government's involvement in medical care? Will we end all the federal government's illusionary insurance programs? Will we ban secret prisons, trials without due process, and assassinations? Will we end our foreign policy of invasion and occupation? For Americans to once again become the standard for a free society, our love of liberty and desire for peace must far surpass any public display of fidelity to the Constitution. We must first look to strong moral character, respect for the rule of law, and an understanding of the proper role of government in a free society.